Hello, this is Brian Hegney, instructor of Game and Interactive Media Design. I want to talk a little bit about this really long and in-depth article that Pascual Hernandez Martinez Quintanilla wrote based on his own work. This guy seems like an amazing 3D modeler, um, and I want to go through it and just mention a few blurbs. A lot of it is really advanced, and a lot of it touches on things that we've already done. And so I want to kind of come through here and talk about some of the things that I want to point out. Notice this guy is already amazing. His goal for this project was to improve his skills in modeling and texturing sci-fi weapons and learn new techniques. Always keep that in mind, whether this is 3D modeling, whether this is level design, whether this is narrative design, whatever you're doing in our game design program, you are never done learning. You can always improve yourself, and so keep that in mind. Look through different people's portfolios and try to mimic things. And so this guy was trying to mimic this gun here that he found, and he wanted to model it and see Chess's hard edge surface modeling. And one of the things he did first, as always, as you saw in the last video, research, research, research. Research all of the different types of guns that you can hold, pistols that you hold, even non-pistol guns. A lot of this is, look at that, there's a dagger there, there's a robot there. You can research everything, everything that you possibly can. And then this is just a board this person made. Now, as I mentioned in the last video when we looked at blocking and how this related to viewing an object from all different angles, this is the first step. So this is the 3D artist trying to get a handle on how does this feel? What is this shape look like? Look at how this person, look at this model. Again, this is an extremely amazing 3D artist, and look at that, the way they're modeling this. This looks like extruded. This could have been started with just a box that was extruded and had its vertices moved around, right? Again, why are they doing this? To understand the shape. And then, of course, here's the next one. Once they understand really the overall shapes, they're going to kind of go and refine this. And the other thing this person points out is they are not necessarily concerned with keeping this in terms of quads that we always talked about. They're not caring about quads. They're not caring about polygon count. They're just trying to figure out the shape. As they're saying, don't worry about topology. We'll get to that later. This is where they get to the high poly parts of this. Once they really figure out which components are which, they're going to focus on really that high poly modeling that we've been kind of looking at. Again, you can see how advanced this is and how many components this is made out of. Look at that red button. The piece that's in is probably another component. This handle here is possibly its own component. They really went all out there. Let's scroll down here. Yeah, they talk about using a high specular level material. So that just means when you're in 3D Studio Max, applying a material that you can really see the specular qualities. This is just a barrel, so it's not that interesting. But when you add a, let's see, when you do add a material, we can increase that specularness here. We haven't done that here. And again, I'm just learning I'm seeing this as a quick tip from this article I just found to really see any sort of inconsistencies in your model. Where is it pinching? And where you'll see it pinching, you'll see like weird little lines. And so by turning up this specular, and maybe even giving it a lighter color, but still a color to differentiate it from the high spec value. Okay. The other thing they talk about is thinking about the normal map that the high poly model is going to make. Now, in this example, this circle that's extruded circle, it's going to give a weird normal map. And so what they're saying is, you know what, if you extrude something downward, it's best to, I guess, inset it a little bit so that angle is greater than 90 degrees. And that's just going to allow the normal map to just be a much better normal map. And so what you see here is a thicker protrusion in the normal map. And you'll see that a higher area for that, I guess, the normal mapping to kind of play around with. It will give depth to your normal map. Just notice how much more room there is here for information on how light is supposed to work here, whereas if it's 90 degrees, there aren't as many pixels of information for that normal map to use, okay? So that's why they're suggesting that. Again, I wish I had read this sooner. This is great information. Now, for our barrels, what does that mean? Well, if you think about our barrel, oops, and isolate. Our high poly, because we were baking that normal, this spacing in here, that's similar to what they're kind of talking about. Imagine if each of these planks were, let's turn off Turbo Smooth. Does that do it? No. Let me go back to, okay. Imagine we made a plank out of just a non-turbo smoothed model. What would have happened is these planks then would have been 90 degrees if these two planks were next to each other. Let's see. No. Okay. Well, let me just go ahead and screw up my model right now so I can show you what I mean. And just move it this way. So if we made a normal map from these types of... Sorry about this, guys. I didn't realize. Okay. Then these would be pushed, that would be a 90-degree bend, but because we put the Turbo Smooth on, this little curve here is actually better for that normal map. It has more area to focus on. So that's good what we did. We did that without even kind of planning on it. So that was good. Our normal maps for our barrels were probably pretty good. Then, of course, they show their low poly model based on their high poly model. Now, something that they did here for their low poly model that we didn't really do is they're pretty okay with these 90-degree corners for this particular gun asset. And I kind of didn't talk to us about that. I'm interested in actually reducing a lot of my props now to have that sharper angle. Okay. But this is something that we did talk about, and I wanted to make sure you saw this. This is a great example. Let me see if I can zoom in there. Yeah. So notice here, when we rotated our barrels, let me Control Z so I don't screw up my freaking barrel. Okay. Let me turn all of these on. There we go. And let me isolate that. Turn off Turbo Smooth. Yes. I'm going to go to my unwrap UVW and open up that UV editor. Right. So if you recall doing this, we had, let's add this texture pattern there. Okay, good. Let me do this and let me end isolate and let me use what I want to point out here is when I was talking a little bit about the unwrapping and how these polygons are being unwrapped on the low poly, and if they jive with the work of the high poly. So right now what you can see is the bluish purplish ridges from that high poly model of those planks. Well, they're going to be offset just a little bit because I did not rotate the top to begin with. And so what that works out for with my normal map here, this is a very low resolution, but what you can see is those planks, because they were not straight in my render, in my unwrapping, they have this weird, well, this is pixelation here. And so that's what this article was talking about. It was saying, when you unwrap your work, make sure all of the normal mappings is going to be perfectly vertical and horizontal, because otherwise we get this really annoying pixelization or aliasing, right? And so that's what we need to be careful of. I want to point out they do talk about using a packing tool called Rhizome UV. We don't have that here, but basically it's designed to ensure that your unwrapping uses the most amount of real estate of your square here as possible, because if you're leaving a lot of space, that means all of your islands and elements are smaller than they could be, and the smaller they are, the less resolution they have. So a little bit about UVWs that we haven't really talked about too much. I used to have a reading, I don't know, or it was a series of videos. It was the videos that where I actually learned the barrel technique from. And it's about this idea that there is a triangle that we can get to in unwrapping, and we can try to get a minimum number of seams, we can try to get a non-distorted UV texture, and we can try to get the highest resolution we could possibly get, but we're really not going to get all three of these. We usually have to, if we want to get a high resolution, we have to sacrifice the seams that we create. And if we, as in we have to increase the number of seams and sometimes to get a higher resolution. And also if we have not enough seams, we could get distorted mesh. And so it's usually an interplay between these three things. And let me just kind of show you what that means. In 3D modeling, I made 3 very quick cylinders. You'll see, I'll look at this third one. The 2 here, this one and that one on the right, the 2 on the right, they have about 3 seams. You can see a seam on the top that runs along the top, a seam on the edge, and a seam down here for the bottom. And this one has the same type of seam. And this one has 0 seams, which you really will never use 0 seams. But I wanted to show you, what at the most basic level, why having fewer seams adds to a little bit of distortion. Of course, if you have 0 seams, you're basically smooshing the cylinder, let me open up that UV editor for the one with 0 seams, and I essentially just, it's like basic, we took these seams and we flattened them like a pancake on either side. And so this circle here is really just a flat line, and that's why it's getting these stretch marks here. So if we look at the actual texture here, that's what that looks like. There's also distortion there. So in this case, the fewer the seams, the more distortion there is. And so then we'll get to the second one. We're actually unwrapped it like a cylinder. And I'm going to open that up. And that should be a little better. I'm going to click on my checker tile. And this now is all around the barrel. We can see these are more, I guess, less distorted, more square-like. And the top is also filled with squares. And so both the sides and the tops are fine the way they are. Now, I packed these as close as I could, but what you'll notice is there's a lot of space here. And actually, there's not that much space here, but if you look at the difference between this and, let's say, this is all extremely packed here, like blown apart and unpacked. And of course this uses more seams to do that. I can't do that here because of the way that these circles are here. I'm not going to blow these apart. They should belong together. These are part of the island, the same island, and the edges here, if I separated this, I could fill up more of the real estate here, but I'd be introducing another seam. Which would be visible. The reason why you might not want seams is look at this texture right here. It might not perfectly align along the seam. And so that is visible in your object. Now, if it's a gun like that and the seam is there because it's a different component, that's perfectly fine. But if it's supposed to be like when we get into the character modeling, if it's supposed to be a continuous surface, that's not as fine, right? That's going to be a really noticeable seam. So there's that. So then you might think, well, maybe I'm supposed to pack it as much as that. And so I wanted to show, whoops, not that, what would happen in this third example, which again, you wouldn't do this in this third example, but I'm just showing you I'm using more of the real estate of this square here, but look, to do that I had to distort some of my polygons, right? And so this top is distorted, and that's where we get these distortion here. So just to point out, that's why there's this triangle. If you think about how you unwrap an object in terms of this triangle here, where'd you go, triangle? There you are. You can't perfect the minimum number of seams with the least distorted and the highest resolution. There's usually a give and take between all of those. All right, let's come back here. So just to point out, there are software designed to really unpack these, or to unwrap and pack these as tightly as possible while keeping the highest resolution. Oh, and I did click here. For the normals here, I did want to point out this. There is a tool that this person uses in 3D Studio. Is that what I wanted to do, or did I want to just skip over? Oh, the text tools smoothing groups from UV shells. So what they did here was in their unwrapping here, they did unwrap it based on the 35-degree angle here, which is, we didn't need to use that in our barrel, so it didn't necessarily apply. But with that said, in the gun, let's come up to this gun, right? With a 35-degree angle, then they're going to say, this is this, where it's a greater angle, like 90 degrees, they're going to separate those apart. But where it's a looser angle, like along the flow of the hand grip, that nice curve there, where those angles are not 35 degrees, those are all going to be unwrapped together in the same island. Now, when they do that, they're automatically going to apply the smoothing group automatically. We applied smoothing groups directly in 3D Studio Max. What they're saying is they're using a smoothing group here. Let's come here. That will apply that based on the different islands that they've created, and I just wanted to show this example here. So in this example, and this is from this tool, it's a 3D Max tool, and it is a tool you can import into 3D Studio Max. It's not native, but you can see here where they unwrapped these elements. Each of these is going to be its own element in the UV unwrap, and then they apply the smoothing groups automatically using that UV channel. We could also do that manually using the smoothing groups component in the edit poly modifier, which is what we did. The other thing that we didn't do that I learned from this article is a technique that I did not learn in the original video series that I learned from with the barrel, was that we could have taken our low poly barrel and applied a turbo smooth to it before we baked the normals. Now let me show you what that means. I'm going to right click and isolate and move these really cool cylinders out of the way. Bye-bye! Now, of course, the smoothing group isn't great here for my low poly, but let me isolate my low poly model, and let me turn this off, turn this off, turn this off. Alright, so this was our low poly barrel, let's say. Well, what we did was when we baked that to texture, do you remember when we had these horrible things, right? And in the video I learned from, we kind of fixed that in the diffuse map. And this is the distortion from taking that low poly, baking the high poly really smooth barrel onto this low poly. Right? So the high poly was super smooth, and when it was baked onto this faceted piece, it was not smooth. And so what they said was, hey, you know what? This reading says you can actually turbo smooth it. Now, I did not set this up to be turbo smooth, so that's why it looks really weird on the top. But I want to tell you, I did another bake where I baked the diffuse map from the high poly onto this after applying turbo smooth, and I want to show you what that looks like. I did a very low res bake, but notice the curvature here. It's a slightly different diffuse map, so don't let that bother you, but it's perfectly flat here because it was baking the high poly rim to really a high poly, or the turbo smooth low poly, which actually was more high poly. The difference is in the text of that article said, hey, when you're done baking the high poly detail down to the low poly, of course you're going to take off that turbo smooth when you export your game model so that it doesn't have all of the polygons associated with it. The only difference is, in my case, now it has a distortion in the middle. I bet that's because, though, after I applied Turbo Smooth, I'm going to check out the UVW unwrap. I have a feeling that, yeah, I would just need to take these polygons and like straighten them out because there's a little bit of distortion right around there. Yes, right here, that distortion was carried through. So I would have to just change the unwrapping just a little bit after I added Turbo Smooth for some reason. Okay. And then I would have gotten a great render. And then you can see my normals map as well is much straighter here. Remember when you all had to change and edit the normals map? Sorry, I didn't realize there was a way to fix that by adding turbo smooth to our low poly. But that's what that part of the article is about. Let's come back here. I just wanted to point out their normals map here. Look at, you guys now know what this means. We've done normal maps. We've done AO as our shadows map. We didn't do ID, position, curvature, thickness. One I've used in the past is ID map. All that does is it takes an object ID that we could add an ID to different elements. Like this red part is one element of the gun, right? So that bakes that into the unwrap, and we can really use that for photoshopping our diffuse map much easier. But you should understand what this means. These are these maps that are kind of placed onto the low poly gun now. Okay, and they did the same concept here. They've got the low poly, and they've got the bake onto the low poly. So they kind of put the shadows map, normal map, not the diffuse map, but just the ambient occlusion and the normal map on here. And you can see there's no, like, where your hand goes, the grip, there's no indentation in the low poly, but it actually is. So this person was doing a very similar concept that we were doing, and so now you should understand that. Let's see, this talks about adding details and color shadings. And here's something that they mentioned here that we didn't do in class. We did not do this in class. I usually like to slightly add the AO map, ambient occlusion map, from the bake on top of the base color as a multiply layer. It's not exactly correct in PBR, physically based rendered materials, but it gives you a more interesting color in the occluded areas, as you can see below. So this will go back and forth between just kind of adding a little bit more shadows. And so what he basically said was, let's come back here. Let's pretend this is our diffuse map. This should look normal to you. This is a shadows map. This should look normal to you. You understand this. As I drag the shadows map into the diffuse map and let go, let's see, I'm going to get rid of the black. Yes, I don't want the black, and I'm going to use contiguous. Let's pretend I don't have this index. Okay, good. What he meant was he took this layer that the shadows map or the ambient occlusion was on and changed it from a normal map, or from normal to multiply. And what that does is, now I can turn that on and off, it just amplifies the shadows here. And now when we go into our material in Unreal Engine, these shadows are going to be amplified and just look much nicer and much richer. And that's what he's showing here. If you look at the shadows, oops, yeah, it's just amplifying the shadows so it looks real. Like you can see it in that viewfinder recess a lot better. Okay. They do talk about emission, which we didn't do. And then for this rendering, this is basically, he's using 3D Studio Max light, or actually, no, this isn't 3D Studio Maps, I'm sorry. This is just a 3D lighting. I actually don't know what this is. I haven't used Marmoset, but what we've done is we're setting up lights in Unreal Engine if you follow the video tutorial coming up. It's a very similar concept. Just basically making sure you have 3-point lighting system and a good viewpoint from a camera, and to take a really nice high-res shaded rendered image that focuses on just your model. And then they talk about going into Photoshop to kind of cleaning up the rendering. And that's what that reading was all about. So a lot of high concept stuff, a lot of things we talked about, a lot of things you maybe didn't realize you already knew, and maybe if you didn't know it when we were modeling, now you have a better understanding of this workflow. The one thing I do regret is not doing this first set with you, this first method of blocking out our model. All right, that was fun for me. I hope it was fun for you, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.